So welcome to Organizational Behavior on Chapter 4, and we're going to talk today about workplace emotions, attitudes, and stress. We're going to talk about how emotions and conscious reasoning influence our attitudes and behaviors, and how to manage that as employees, but also as a manager. How do you understand these concepts so that you can become a better manager, managing the emotional states of your employees as well. So I'm sure you all have examples of where you got too hot-headed at work or emotional in the workplace, and you made some bad decisions or it affected your attitudes temporarily. We all get emotional in the workplace. We sometimes regret what we say. We get emotionally instantly say things that we should have not normally said, but we're all human and we really just can't help it. So today we're just going to talk about how to be aware of that, how to manage it, and how to understand it better. So let's talk about the construct that we're going to use in this class today. It was really around what's the difference between emotions and attitudes. Emotions are really just short-lived. In many cases, you don't even realize you're having them. And attitudes are long-term belief systems around how you think about the world. And now that you have the terminology down, it's important to understand that emotions are really just temporarily affect how we feel and what we think temporarily. So now that we're aware about that, we need to understand that when we get emotional, we need to learn techniques to slow our emotions down so that we can get our real attitudes a chance to catch up and override how our emotions are overriding us. So it's how to breathe a little, stop, think, give ourselves a little bit of time. And I'm going to talk about some various techniques through this class and through this lecture on how to short circuit those natural tendencies we have to get emotional. The first concept that we're going to talk about in this class is really around the concept of cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is the concept of you feeling uncomfortable of the conflict between what your emotions are telling you to feel and say versus what your attitudes and your long-term belief systems know. It's the mental stress that's associated in the effort in trying to act one way when we feel a totally different way. And so that dissonance can often be very different depending on the industries and the kind of role that you have. And so when it comes to that, is like when you think about this attitude of if you're a nurse or a doctor, your cognitive dissonance is a lot higher because you're struggling to manage your emotional states all the time because you're often in stressful situations dealing with stressful patients that are very emotional at any given one time, and you have to always learn to maintain an even keel. You know, how bad would it be in a hospital environment if your doctor was getting really emotional and getting angry and loud, and it would scare patients, for example, or a nurse for that matter. So when it comes to managing emotions in the workplace, things are also really changing very fast. Traditionally, there was there's a greater expectations to manage your emotions in the workplace. But contemporary perspectives have really changed, and leaders are expected to showcase their authenticity and their humanity in the workplace today. So we see a lot of friction points between different generations in the workplace. I see it personally myself, where, you know, in the past, I was taught to be very professional and very formal and not to be very unemotional in the workplace. But today that has really changed, and you really have to bring your humanity in the workplace for this new generation of employees. So you see older workers saying that younger employees need to be less emotional and more professional. When you see younger employees saying older employees are too formal, wooden, unemotional, unauthentic, and not human enough. And so even teaching this class over the last 10 years, what I've seen is a big change too, where 10 years ago, I would never dress casually in the workplace or in the university to teach. I would always wear a suit and tie every class, maintain professional distance with students. But now students are expecting a lot more connections and more humanities with their university professors in a way that keeps them connected. To bring your humanity in the workplace, to showcase those emotions, to tell them that you're human and you make mistakes. And they want to hear these stories of authenticity in the class environment and in the workplace. And we're also seeing that emotional norms are also different according to the workplace. Different industries and different cultures have different norms in terms of showing their emotions. For example, a study in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology in 2015 saw that variations existed across different cultures. For example, 81% of Ethiopians and 74% of Japanese agreed that it was very unprofessional to show your emotions in the workplace. Whereas in the same study, 19% of people from Spain, people from Cuba, and Egyptians agreed with this statement. So naturally, putting a Japanese person in a room with someone from Egypt would cause a lot of friction if they're unaware of these cultural norms at play in terms of emotional states. You could imagine hilariously watching as someone from Egypt would attempt a warm embrace and a deep hug on meeting someone from Japan, and the Japanese person stepping back in horror and trying to avoid at all costs that hug, and the person from Egypt taking great offense at that involuntary reaction from that Japanese person. I should also mention that we see also different emotional states across different industries as well. I'd love to read in your comment box if your ideas of what emotional norms did you come across traveling to different countries or working in different industries. For example, like I noticed that in the construction industry that there's a high allowance for your emotion to bring your emotions to the workplace, to yell, to scream, and to get frustrated. And maybe you can describe some other industries where there's a higher expectations of managing your emotional norms in the comments. So I'd love to hear that too. I'd love to read that and comment too. So now that we've talked about emotional norms, I think let's talk about how do we handle that? How do we fix that as an individual, as a manager? Well, the real technique is really to work on the emotional intelligence or the EQ of your teams. And this is important because this concept is so critical in having good relationships with others in the teams and creating better teams with more engaged organizations, and also contributes to better personal happiness. So what is EQ in the context of this chapter? And EQ is made up of 4 levels defined by Daniel Goldman of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And really it's the skill of managing your emotional states and others around you. I've got a separate YouTube video on that, so if you want to watch more detail on that, you can, to understand that in better detail, and also look at the slides in Prezi. The good thing about this is that when it comes to building your EQ, when you've got strong EQ, you're able to manage your emotions better. And the good thing is that the wonderful thing about EQ is that the older you get, even if you do nothing, your EQ tends to improve through the research that we see. But definitely EQ needs training, coaching, and feedback from others to really improve. Other viewpoints in this class that I'll talk about later will be social intelligence, and I'll get into that more detail as well. It's not in the Prezi slides yet because it's a relatively recent concepts, but I'll make sure to highlight that conversation as we debrief the textbook during the class when we see each other. The other viewpoints I'd like to point out in this Prezi slides is to make sure that you watch the Brene Brown video on the difference between sympathy and empathy. Fantastic video with a really strong animation visual, because it really describes how you need to stop being sympathetic and be more empathetic in the workplace. And also make sure you watch Roman's video on empathy as well, a fantastic video on the description of how to build a more empathetic organization. And I will make sure to talk about this book called Empathy during the class lecture as well, so remind me if I don't bring it up. And I'll make sure to talk about during class how to improve your emotional and social intelligence and techniques to build on that. I want to make sure that I maintain this video to a certain length, so I'm going over too much time now. So I'll make sure I discuss that during class. And the next concept I also want to make sure that in the Prezi slides you look at is job satisfaction in the workplace. So how satisfied are employees in the workplace? Well, the answer really depends on the personality of employees, the training that they have on EQ, the workplace, and the country that they live in. So global surveys have indicated that there's a very different range in terms of satisfaction levels according to where people work in which country. And we do see that there's extensive research that shows that high job satisfaction is critical because it shows that happier employees tend to deliver better service and therefore serve customers better and therefore produce better revenue. And this, you can reference that in the service profit chain model in the textbook for greater detail there. Another concept I really want to talk about in this lecture is also the consequences of job dissatisfaction and strategies to increase organizational effective commitment. And organizational effective commitment is really the emotional attachment that our employees have to the organization. And during the class lecture, I'll talk more about how to generate that within the workplace. What you don't really want to have in the workplace is continuance commitment, which is where employees just feel they can't work anywhere else. They're stuck to the organization, they don't have any options, and they feel like they can't work anywhere else because their skills are irrelevant. And this is something you don't want to have, because when you have this kind of structure, is that all the research proves that these types of employees tend to care less about the organization, perform less, try to be lazy, and have a lot of social loafing in the workplace. And so you have to really manage that very carefully. In the class lecture, we'll also talk about the concepts of the stress experience, and we'll talk about the general adaptation syndrome, and there's some slide references on what causes workplace stress, so make sure you look at that as we debrief. And the last element I also want to make sure is that looking at the ways how we need to manage stress, but I also want you to make sure you watch 2 videos before the class lecture, because we won't have chances to debrief on that in detail apart from talking about them, because they're long videos. I want you to make sure you watch them before class, which is Kelly and Dr. Michael Evans' videos on how to manage stress, because students really enjoy these 2 videos because they're outstanding in explaining and understanding what happens with stress, how we react to it, and what we can do to manage it better. And we'll debrief around some of the techniques that these 2 talk about in terms of cognitive behavior therapy, or what's called CBT therapy. And we'll get into much more discussion during the class lecture, but I want to make sure you guys watch those 2 videos first, because we'll be debriefing a lot about those two videos for sure. And so they're important subjects, and I think students always find those 2 videos really fascinating for sure. So other than that, hope you get prepared for chapter 4 on organizational behavior. I can't wait to see you again in class. We've been having a lot of fun together. So I'll see you guys shortly. Talk soon. Bye.